Cahill, and thank you to everyone for their contributions and indeed for their questions. Firstly, to turn to Deputy Haughey's, firstly in terms of our support for the approach for migration and how to address in particular the root cause, and that Taoiseach addressed this in his speech today, but also when he presented to his European colleagues at the Council meeting last week. Africa has come under, I suppose, the heading of external relations as well as migration, and I think we need to acknowledge that our relationship with Africa should not just be solely placed in the migration box, but that we need to continue to develop our relationships, that we need to continue not only to provide fund for the EU Africa Trust Fund, which is there to address a lot of the economic issues, a lot of the human rights issues, a lot of I suppose, references to conflict within the individual country and member states as well, but also by building that relationship we can try and address politically the challenges that they are facing, and I think that's why it's important. On the 18th of December a meeting has been held between the EU heads of African states with the European Union, which will be led by Chancellor Kurz, as Austria is hosting the presidency until the end of the year. So this will give us an opportunity to have further political dialogue, but also to engage with some of the proposals that are being put before the European Council in terms of disembarkation platforms, in terms of trying to address, as I've said, the root causes not just for the European and the African countries, but those in the Middle Eastern region as well. In terms of climate change, apologies, and there are a number of deputies who have raised this question in terms of climate change and the specific report that was published, which, as you said, highlighted the fact that impacts of global warming of 1.5% will clearly highlight the negative impacts of climate change and very much illustrate the unprecedented urgency to step up our global efforts to try and reduce the impacts of climate change. It makes very clear that the parties who are in agreement to the Paris Agreement need to significantly strengthen their future commitments. That includes Ireland. I know there was concern that we didn't raise the carbon tax. However, I think it's important to note that the Minister for Finance has already committed in the budget of this year to put in place a long-term trajectory for carbon tax increases out to 2030. This is in line with the recommendations by the Climate Change Advisory Council and the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. You also have to look at the fact that we have a national policy position on climate action and low carbon development. This is underpinned by a Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, which was implemented back in 2015. We have a national mitigation plan, and the purpose of this is to specify the policy measures which are required in order to manage Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. You also have the publication this year of Ireland's National Development Plan, and I think what's important about that is that it reaffirms the Government's commitment to transitioning Ireland to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy and society, and most importantly of the funding that has been allocated for that plan. Almost 22 billion of that between Exchequer and non-Exchequer resources are there to address the transition to the low-carbon and a climate-resilient society. So that's over €1 in 5 years that's been spent is specifically looking at climate change and trying to mitigate the challenges that we know we're facing, and obviously the report that was published at the Council and prior to that highlights the challenges that we face, but I think if anything it refocuses all of our minds to the challenge that lies ahead, and Ireland certainly and this government certainly is aware of those challenges, and we are trying to address them. And I think as well the increase to the overall budget for climate change this year is a factor of that. Maybe just to touch on Deputy Connolly's question, the exact figure I'm not exactly aware. We do know that there are targets, we do know that there are fines, but maybe I could come back to the Deputy with the exact figure on that. In terms of the MFF, or sorry, no, in terms of the spread of disinformation, I suppose our external borders and internal security, these were key issues that were addressed at the Council last week. In particular, Ireland focused on the spread of disinformation. We ourselves have started to look at how this could impact on elections here in Ireland, and by using reference to other countries where we have seen there have been challenges before. In particular as well, the area of cybersecurity is something that we know threatens elections, and we've seen most recently as well where that has been raised, and I suppose issues are still ongoing and questions are still being raised about the most recent US presidential election. But in terms of cybersecurity and the spread of disinformation, the Irish point of view is very much that we need to strengthen both of those, that we need to have wider cooperation across all levels of society, not just political but civil society as well, and this was reaffirmed by all 27 member states at last week's council meeting. The issue of the EU border in terms of Frontex, and again Deputy Connolly raised this issue, there wasn't a consensus reached by the 27 member states. The proposal, as you've mentioned, was to increase Frontex by 10,000 staff. There is still questions raised as to who they would report to, what competencies they would have, and I suppose this is why there wasn't a consensus reached, and those discussions are still ongoing. From an Irish point of view, this is not something that directly impacts on us. We're obviously not part of the Schengen area either, and so our position is very much to support those member states most impacted. It's to be as proactive and as supportive in the negotiations, because there are very differing views depending on which member state we are talking to. There are very differing views depending on what part of the European Union you are in and how close to the borders your country is. And obviously we need to show solidarity to those member states that are most impacted, and we know, particularly in terms of the Brexit negotiations, the member states that are least impacted are very much showing solidarity towards Ireland as well, and so we have to be conscious of that. In terms of the Brexit discussions, Deputy Chamber raised a number of issues. Firstly, the MFF, to maybe move backwards, without specifically getting into a Brexit-specific fund. The negotiations on the MFF and the next budget have been underway for well over a year now, and in the last two discussions that we've had, I have, and from an Irish point of view in Belgium, have raised the concerns around the requirement and the need for member states who are more impacted than others when a crisis arises or some form of economic impact is felt by a member state, without specifically mentioning maybe Brexit, because the budget is 7 years ahead. We don't know what other challenges may lay ahead, but we do need to ensure that there is flexibility within the budget, whether it is Brexit, whether it is some form of economic challenge that might not just impact on Ireland or Belgium, as I said, two countries most impacted or likely to be most impacted by Brexit, but that other countries would have the flexibility within a budget to receive financial support if they need it otherwise. So this issue has been raised, and we will continue to raise it and make sure that if we need it, and that the support is there, that the financial support is there from a European point of view as well. In terms of our ports, of course, we're talking about preparedness here. There is a national competency, and that is work that we are doing. Each and every single minister and department is identifying the challenges and the possible threats that they are facing and that their industries and their businesses are facing, ranging from the worst case scenario to obviously what we hope will be the best case scenario. There are also competencies within the European Parliament and the Commission, and they are doing work to try and address those as well, in particular in terms of transit. And we know obviously the land bank is going to be a particular issue in terms of aviation, in terms of ensuring that there is still the free movement, well, as free a movement as possible, and in particular for us that is a huge concern and a huge issue. The Commission published a report recently looking at ports within Europe and on the European border, highlighting the challenges that they may face, particularly given the fact that if there is any kind of a border between the UK and the rest of the European Union, that there will be delays, that there will be checks, and of course from an Irish point of view we can't be held up as part of those delays and as part of those checks, and that's something that we're engaging with our European colleagues, particularly Belgium and France, to try and address those concerns that have been raised. Deputy O'Sullivan has raised a number of issues, I suppose in terms of human rights, in terms of the particular situation at the moment in Myanmar, and if you could just allow me to come back. Obviously the situation in Myanmar is of great concern. The report of which was an independent fact-finding mission, showed evidence of human rights violations which absolutely amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes by members of the Burmese military, but also other security forces. we strongly support ensuring those who are perpetrators and those who are perpetrators of crime, that they are held to account in close cooperation with the UNHCR Council and in close cooperation with our other European colleagues. We are monitoring the situation with our colleagues. We're trying to work with the international partners to pursue a resolution to this crisis. And I think in the meantime, what we continue to do and can continue to do is to support the humanitarian assistance that is being provided, and the organisations in particular that are providing that assistance. I suppose in connection with Yemen and the significant challenges that arise, and the Taoiseach has outlined this to you. He met with the Saudi ambassador on the 18th of October this month. He raised the very serious concerns, not just in relation to the Khashoggi case, but also the ongoing conflict in Yemen. I too, like yourself, was horrified by the recent reports by the UN's humanitarian coordinator that between 12 and 13 million people may possibly be a threat of famine or at risk of famine in the coming months. We have over 22 million who are requiring some humanitarian assistance, some form of humanitarian assistance, and so this has to be of concern to each and every one of us. We are providing support, we are providing humanitarian assistance. We've committed to 16.5 million in bilateral humanitarian assistance. Of this, 4 million was contributed in March of this year to the UN Yemen Humanitarian Fund, and as I've said, when the Taoiseach was meeting the Saudi ambassador, he stressed Ireland's concern on this issue, and I think we need to stress as well at the same time that military victory, even if it is achievable, it will not address the root causes of the conflicts, and so negotiations in this regard need to be reinvigorated, and Ireland and the EU fully support the work of Martin Griffiths, who is of course the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, and his team in those negotiations, and we hope and we do absolutely support that they are reinvigorated and that we can try and address again the root causes of this conflict. But we will continue to provide financial support in that regard. We will continue to raise these issues, and I think it's something that we need to continue, and you're right to continue to raise it here on the floor of the Dáil. You've mentioned the arms conflict and the embargo. This is something that we have raised. However, currently there is no consensus at an EU level, and again you have differing views on this, and this is something that we need to continue to discuss and to engage and to raise at EU levels. There is no consensus to impose an arms embargo in relation to this conflict. However, I think we need to, as I've said, continue to raise this. We need to continue to work with the UN to promote the vital work of Martin Griffiths, which are obviously essential in reinstating peace talks, and which are essential for providing a permanent solution to the overall crisis. Okay, I think I have, if I could...
You've answered the questions and you're happy, you've had enough time
I think
for
so,
your
unless... In terms of the journalists, I think this has been raised on a number of occasions within the European Council, but also in my own General Affairs Council, specifically after the death of the Maltese journalists. It has been raised in a number of formats in terms of the freedom of speech, the freedom of the right to the freedom of speech, the right to the freedom of dissemination of information, and I suppose in terms of human rights violations and regulations, what we would encourage in any of these cases is that those perpetrators and those who have ordered these killings or who have carried out these killings, that they are held accountable, that each member state where this has taken place, that there is a transparent investigation into all of these killings, and that it is not acceptable that a journalist, no matter what country they are living in, that they could be subject to violence or indeed murdered for their views or for the work that they are doing to try and ensure that people's rights, that their freedoms of speech and expression are upheld. And so this is something that we have spoken very strongly, and I have spoken very strongly of within my own committee, that I know a number of other members have spoken of very strongly, and something that we will continue to raise, given, I think, in light of the most recent death of Mr Khashoggi, of which we all understand he was subject to the most horrendous and most gruesome death, and I absolutely believe that those perpetrators need to be held accountable, and those who ordered his death absolutely need to be held accountable, and we will, from an Irish point of view and as members of the European Union, continue to raise these concerns and continue to stress the significance and the importance of the freedom of the press and the right to free speech.
Before
now I have to find my speech.
Minister. If you wrap up, but you've taken a lot of time and you only have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll be as quick as possible. So I want to thank those who have contributed to this debate and what was a very important meeting of the European Council. In addition to reporting in detail on the Article 50 on Brexit, the Taoiseach has outlined the discussions on the Euro Summit. As he indicated, I will focus my remarks on internal security and external relation issues that arose on Thursday. There has been good progress at EU level in recent years in supporting Member States to ensure internal security and to fight terrorism. We now need to further reinforce Europe's long-term response to new and emerging threats. The European Council's discussions on internal security took into account the outcome of the informal summit in Salzburg, where leaders had an open-ended exchange on the proposals outlined in President Juncker's State of the Union address. These include measures to complete the security union, to fight money laundering, to remove online terrorist content and to protect elections from malign foreign influence, as well as to reopen the Schengen borders and to use the civil protection mechanism. Their objective is to add value to existing and planned national measures and to further strengthen our collective security in a rapidly changing security environment. While Ireland's participation in this area is limited due to our position under Protocol 21 and our non-participation in the Schengen border are key, we are generally supportive of EU measures to protect the internal security of the Union and of its citizens. Leaders focus in particular on cybersecurity, which has become increasingly challenging in recent years, with new and innovative forms of cybercrime, including in relation to the integrity of our electoral systems, continuing to emerge. Indeed, here in Ireland, we established an interdepartmental group last December to consider the risks to our electoral process, including through our examination of recent experiences in other democratic countries with respect to the use of social media by third parties. The abuse of the online space by people promoting terrorism, whether it's by encouraging or directing atrocities, is also of great concern to us. The global nature of the internet means that individual countries cannot respond effectively alone. From Ireland's perspective, we support the concept of a collective response mechanism. We need to cooperate in combating such illegal activities effectively while continuing to promote an open, global, free, peaceful and secure cyberspace, one where fundamental rights and freedoms, in particular the right to freedom of expression, access to information, data protection and privacy and security, as well as our core EU values and principles, are fully applied and respected both within the EU and globally. In light of the holistic tax in Salisbury and the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, leaders are welcoming a new regime of restrictive measures to address these threats. Ken Corley, just very briefly turning to external relations discussed. This includes climate change as well as developments in Venezuela, our relations with our partners in Africa and the Arab League. There was an exchange in the recent elections in Bosnia where nationalist and ethnic tensions were once again highlighted. On climate change, acknowledging the latest report, which deputies have mentioned, which unequivocally confirms the negative impacts of climate change, leaders agreed on the need for ambition in advance of the COP24 in Poland in December this year. Finally, there was also an exchange on relations to Saudi Arabia, firstly in the context of regional developments and the shocking death of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In addition to the need to fully respect human rights, Ireland is committed to promoting and protecting freedom of expression, freedom of the media and civil space, and we join with our EU partners in stressing the need for a continued, thorough, credible and transparent investigation into his killing, which has shed proper clarity in the circumstances surrounding it and which will ensure the full accountability of all of those responsible. I would finally just finish by thanking the deputies for their attention, their remarks in the course of this debate. As the Taoiseach has made very clear finally on Brexit, this remains our priority. It is important that we continue to play an active and constructive role across the EU agenda, that we contribute to the ongoing debate about the future of Europe with a view to shaping its direction. And indeed, I was honoured to lead the Citizens' Dialogue on the Future of Europe over the past year, and I look forward to continuing my involvement in this key area in this vital period ahead.
Thank you, Minister. And just before